afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with our special talk today with Dr. Edward Freeman. I want to start today's master talk by giving you a brief introduction about the work of Dr. Edward Freeman. He is an university professor, an awesome professor of business administration, and an academic director of the Institute for Business in Society at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. He is the author or editor of over 100 volumes and 200 articles in the areas of stakeholder management, business strategy, and business ethics. Dr. Freeman is perhaps best known for his award-winning book, Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, originally published in 1984, in which he traced the origins of the stakeholder idea to a number of others and suggested that business build their strategy around the relationship with key stakeholders. Dr. Freeman has a PhD in philosophy from Washington University and a BA in mathematics and philosophy from Duke University. He was recently awarded 6 honorary doctorates in economics from Comillas University in Madrid, the Hanken School of Economics in Helsinki, and Leuven University in Germany, in management from Radboud University in Leiden, Netherlands, from Sherbrooke University in Canada, and from Tampere University in Finland for his work on stakeholder theory and business ethics. So I want to welcome Dr. Edward Freeman. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Alfonso. It's very very nice to be here with you, even if it's only virtual. And I apologize, but my Spanish is very elementary, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying it. I do have a son who's working with me to we have a podcast called the Stakeholder Podcast that we've done about 100 episodes on, and his favorite place to go, where he's been now and is trying to get fluent in Spanish, is to travel around Mexico. And so I have a nice story to tell him about being invited to speak to you today there. That was a very kind introduction, Professor. I get way more credit than I deserve about stakeholder theory, and as I've gotten older, I've just learned to say thank you. So thank you very much for that. I want to talk today about sort of the history of stakeholder theory, where I think it is today, and what some of the challenges are. And I'd be happy. I'd be happy if we have time to answer any questions that you have, or if you decide to have questions later, just email them to me. I'm pretty easy to find at University of Virginia. There are a lot of people who claim to have invented the stakeholder idea. I used to say I was the only person to have written about it who did not claim to have invented it. Rather, I tried to just figure out who did. And the trail leads, I was at Wharton at the time doing a postdoc with PhD, almost PhD in philosophy. And the stakeholder idea was sort of in the air at a research center there called the Bush Center, and then the Wharton Applied Research Center. In fact, one of our clients, where I spent some fairly happy days, was Cerveceria Cuauhtemoc in Monterey. And that was one of the projects that the people at Wharton had done. And even though the government could have a lot of influence on Cerveceria Cuauhtemoc, they hadn't allocated many resources to dealing with government. And so the mismatch here was between the stakeholders' influence and the kind of resources spent on understanding that stakeholder. What we tried to do was develop some ideas that we said, like, generalize the marketing approach, use the same kind of segmentation strategy with stakeholders that you do with customers, figure out about negotiating, those kinds of things that we tried to apply to stakeholders that, for the most part, business theory hadn't done much with. My boss came to me one day and said, you know, this stakeholder thing, do you want to see what you can make of it? Do you want to see what you can make of it? You know, what would the world be like if people took it seriously, if business people took it seriously? And I thought this was going to be, yeah, I'll write a paper and that'll be it. You know, I didn't realize it was going to turn into 40 plus years of kind of a lifetime of work. One of the first things I tried to do was to figure out where the idea came from. I knew that Russell Ackoff at Wharton had written about it in a book called Redesigning the Future. And he attributed part of it to one of the grand theorists of business strategy, Idor Ansoff. And it turns out what happened, what I was able to find was that Ansoff and a number of other people were in the planning department at Lockheed at the time. And then they all kind of left and went to Stanford Research Institute. And they did a report called the Business Intelligence Report. And in those days, when you did strategy, you sort of did environmental scanning. What this meant was you do trends. What are the trends happening out in the environment? And here, environment's general. It's not just, you know, birds and bunnies and trees. It's the kind of general business environment. And you'd figure out trends, and then you'd say, well, how's our company positioned with respect to those trends? And that was kind of the first step in strategic planning. And the SRI folks had done this report, and they had organized the trends by customer trends, supplier trends, employee trends, this sort of stuff. And as I was told the story by a guy named Bob Stewart, who was there at the beginning, they had a technical writer, a woman, of course, who, when they were talking about, what are we going to call all these groups? She said, you mean these stakeholders? And they went, yeah, that's exactly what we mean. And that she knew the word as an ancient Scottish word that meant the people that hold the stakes in a gamble. So literally they're the stakeholders. Let's say we're playing, you know, a gambling game. We give the stakes, the money, to somebody else to hold while we play it. And that's where the original word comes from. Of course, the idea that business should be responsible to groups it affects is much older than that. You can see it in India in the founding papers of the Tata Group in the 19th century. You can see it even back in the sacred books in the Mahabharata, and you can see it in many other sort of scriptures around the world that talk about responsibility and that mention business, which not all of them do. A second piece of the origin story is that goes to a theorist who is Swedish, Eric Rindman. And Rindman wrote a book in 1964 called Industrial Democracy in the Workplace. And Rindman talked about you know, those who were important for the firm's survival. The Swedish word was interessant. And at around the same time that SRI was talking about stakeholders, interessant got translated as stakeholder. And so I would look at SRI and Rindman as sort of the co-founders of the idea, which is again based on much older ideas that business has sort of responsibilities to society. If you read some of the founding papers of companies like Johnson & Johnson and General Electric and others just in the US, you'll find these ideas. You'll find them in Chester Bernard and Mary Parker Follett and other sort of early pioneers of management and theory. My role in this was, you know, I did end up writing a paper called Stakeholder Management in '77, I think. That's a long time ago, probably before most of you were born. We sent the paper to a journal to be listed, because that's what you had to do back in the day when there's no internet, right? Nobody knew about your stuff unless you made them, you let them know, and there were no sites to upload. So you had to, each journal had a page of things called working papers. So I sent this working paper to a journal to be listed. I don't remember which one it was, and not to be published, now just to be listed. Editor calls and says, okay, great, we got it. You know, we'll list it, but there's a really terrible typo in the title. And I said, now you got to remember, I'm maybe 25 at this time, 26 at the latest. And so I'm thinking typo, oh my God, what have I done? And the editor said, yeah, it says stakeholder management, but we figured you meant shareholder. So, we'll just change it for you. And I said, please don't do that. But that's kind of the early history. I thought I was a strategy guy. I was teaching strategy at Wharton. I was interested in strategy. I was doing strategy consulting with companies like Service Denmark all over the world. It was really a great time helping to build this organization called the Wharton Applied Research Center. And the problem was nobody in the academic field of strategy cared. 1980 or so, the early 80s were the heyday of Michael Porter and competitive strategy, and the old idea about strategy as what's good for the enterprise as a whole, which had a lot, that's where the field came from, and trying to figure out how all these pieces, marketing and finance and operations and HR, how those things fit together. That was going away in favor of economic, more hard-nosed economic analysis. And I guess the stakeholder idea got branded with the kind of old, softer way of thinking about things. And nobody had to do it. So, I was a young guy, a little bit lonely as a philosopher. I didn't know all this business stuff. And so I started hanging out with people who did corporate social responsibility and business ethics. And it turned out they cared a lot about these things. They didn't know a lot about how real business actually worked. And I was enmeshed in that. We had projects with, 10, 12 companies out trying to help them figure out how to deal with all these stakeholders that they had and how to integrate them and stuff. And it was a great 4 or 5 years. I decided I wanted to be an academic, and so I decided I'd write a book. What I didn't know, just to show you how crazy this could be, what I didn't know was you don't write books in business schools. You write articles. Yeah, you write books, they don't count. Because as a philosopher, if you don't write a book, nobody's going to take you seriously. And so I wrote this book, and it was just, to me, it's hilarious today about how much I didn't know. I didn't think that the stakeholder idea was even the most interesting idea in this book. After all, we called it strategic management, a stakeholder approach, not stakeholder management, a strategic approach. Right? And that was very deliberate. We wrote it. I wrote it as the publisher's going to market it as a textbook, which it was a terrible as a textbook, but that's a different story. I thought the stakeholder idea was so simple, and I still do. Look, every business has always and will always create and sometimes destroy, usually unintentionally, value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money, and sometimes others. But certainly those 5 are necessary for the survival and health of a company. And I just thought that was common sense. My wife, who by this time has had an MBA from Wharton, read the draft of the book, and she looked at me and said, well, you know, this is pretty much common sense. You're never going to make a living at this. And she was right about the common sense part, I think. Good thing that happened in this old book, people said to me, well, so what's it like to have written a business bestseller? This book has something I checked the other day, 51,000 citations or something ridiculous like that. And I said, well, I don't really know, because, you know, they only printed 2,000 copies. And so either, for all the citations, there are either some copies in libraries with the ink rubbed off the page, they've been used so much, or else nobody's actually read this old book, which I think is probably what's true. Because, you know, it has a very distinctive view of what the stakeholder idea is. And it's unlike a lot of the ways it has evolved. What happened was there's lots of work to be done. This seemed to energize, at least referring to the book, seemed to energize a lot of people to do this work. And no one, you know, some by I would say the mid 1990s, people start to pay attention. They start to pay attention to the stakeholder idea. You found it referred to a lot more. And there was an interest group in the Strategic Management Society on stakeholder theory. So I was finally, after damn near 20 years, I guess, made more legitimate by the strategy folks. But that's neither here nor there. Today, there's work being done all around the world. If you Google stakeholder theory or stakeholder management or stakeholder capitalism, you get millions of hits. And I stopped trying to keep up with that a long time ago. But I think one way to think about it is there's sort of 4 ways to understand the what now people would call stakeholder capitalism. And let me just say, I don't put a lot of interest into, is that stakeholder capitalism or stakeholder management or stakeholder engagement or stakeholder theory. That doesn't really matter to me. It all comes down to the same idea, that businesses create value for stakeholders. And whatever you end up calling it doesn't really matter for me. I kind of like stakeholder capitalism, but that's you know, in part because I'm an Adam Smith fan, and Adam Smith, the so-called father of capitalism, of course, never used the word capitalism. We get capitalism mostly from Marx, which is a little bit like letting your biggest rival in football design your uniforms. You know, so they're probably going to look ridiculous if that happens. But I think you can look at the work today in stakeholder capitalism and say, well, really, there are kind of 4 main ways people understand this. The first way to understand it, and when the Business Roundtable in the US came out with a statement that said, we need stakeholder capitalism now. And when Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, said, we need stakeholder capitalism in a sense of purpose, and State Street and lots of others came out with this, you could, I have a friend who said, what do you think, who bet another friend, how long before the Wall Street Journal comes out with an anti-stakeholder capitalism editorial? And the other friend said, yeah, probably a week. And it happened that same day. So you knew these sorts of things would happen. And the first way is to see stakeholder capitalism as what's called virtue signaling. Look, this is just, it's the same old stuff. It's just about companies trying to get people to think they're good. But we really know that companies are just about the money, you know, and they're really kind of greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in, only worried about the money. And this is virtue signaling. It's signaling that something else is going on here, but not really. It's not. A second view, and a little better, is a view that says, oh, stakeholder capitalism. This is just a new word for corporate social responsibility. And that sort of fits with especially a kind of European focus on business and civil society, where CSR is kind of alive and well. Now, I had argued in an '84 book that CSR was not a great idea because, you know, I've never known what to say to somebody who said, look, your business is terrific. Customers want your product because it makes their lives better. Suppliers want to work with you because you make them better and they make you better. Employees love working for you because you treat them with dignity and respect and you pay them well. And communities want you there because you're a community builder and you're making a ton of money. What I want to know is, are you socially responsible? See, I don't know what that means. If you're being responsible to all your stakeholders, what does it mean to say, are you socially responsible? It seems to me the right idea here is CSR, corporate stakeholder responsibility. But nonetheless, the CSR people, I think, have their, at least their hearts are in the right place. So many people said, well, this is just CSR, same stuff. And there's a kind of third view from the World Economic Forum, and the guy who runs it, who claimed he invented this stuff. He may have invented it, but he invented it 10 years after they did at Stanford Research Institute or more. And the World Economic Forum has always seen itself as kind of trying to get stakeholders together to have a conversation. And that's a good thing that I admire. But stakeholder capitalism isn't just about top-down elites deciding what new policies we need. And then the rest of us, I guess, fight over the crumbs. I don't know how that's supposed to go. But the top-down elites view of this, changing society at the sort of most general level, usually for the most part doesn't work very well. And there's a fourth view of stakeholder capitalism, which is my view, and lots of other people's, which is it's about the business model. This is about this is a new narrative, a new story about what it takes to run a successful business. And yeah, sure, there may need to be some top-down elites that need to get their act together. Yeah, CSR and may need to do some stuff, and maybe virtue signaling is not such a bad thing. But fundamentally, this is about how individual businesses create value and sometimes destroy it for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people, and money. And if we don't see it as at the level of the business model, really not much is going to change. Now, the good news about all this is that while a bunch of us academics were writing about it, there are a whole bunch of people in the world out doing it. Some of them had been doing it for a long time. It's an insurance company in New York, that New York Life. I had interviewed the CEO and some of their senior managers about that they've been trying to do this for over 100 years. There are companies wherever I've been in the world, from Turkey to Mexico to Canada to Australia to Indonesia to Thailand, who take a stakeholder approach. And that stakeholder approach says, I have to figure out how a number of things go together. And we wrote this book, two colleagues of mine and I wrote this book that came out right in time for the pandemic, so no one's probably ever heard of it, called The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-offs. I was at a meeting at the White House in the last days of the Obama administration, Now, you might remember back in those days, the Obama administration thought they had 4 more years with Hillary Clinton, and of course they didn't. And this was a meeting at the Department of Labor run by Tom Perez, who was Secretary of Labor. And he wanted to know how could we actually make this transition go faster? And what did government need to do? What could he do to accelerate this? And both President Obama and hopefully President-elect Clinton were very interested. And he had people that had started all these movements. You know, there's conscious capitalism, there's creative capitalism, there's inclusive capitalism, there's capitalism 2.0, there's the one by the Virgin Atlantic guy, there's connected capitalism, and then there's impact investing and ESG investing and socially responsible investing and social entrepreneurship, and the list is long. And at the White House at this meeting, there are a lot of the people that had started these movements, you know, were there, and I was lucky enough to get invited. And I just sort of thought, what's the brand is the wrong question. I thought about, well, you know, what are the 4 or 5 things that we really got to change about this underlying narrative, this underlying story about business, if we're going to make capitalism better, if we're going to leave a world for our children that's worthy of human beings. You know, what do we have to do here? And it wasn't a throw out the old story. I had by this time managed to, pardon my language, piss off both the left and the right. The people on the left, the progressives on the left, thought I was a sellout to business because business was about the money. And the people on the right thought I was a communist because business is about the money. And they shared this old story. And I'll just add as an aside, I don't know what it is to be in the middle in the US today. It seems like the people in the middle just have the worst ideas of the left and the right. That doesn't make any sense to me. But, you know, the people on the left want to say, this is, you know, you can't try to dress this up as the business is doing something good. And the people on the right say, look, this is about the money. It's about just trying to make as much money as you can. And business to me looks very different than that. And it looks very different to all the companies that are trying to do it differently. So we said, look, there are at least 5 things that has to happen. First of all, we got to understand what purpose is. The old story makes a mistake about purpose. You know, it says the purpose of business is to make money for shareholders. Best example I've got is, you know, I need red blood cells to live. But it doesn't follow that the purpose of my life is to make red blood cells. Even if, as I had to do some years ago, I got both my hips replaced. That was a fun weekend, or like 2 years. But I lost a lot of blood in the surgery, and I had to actually work on making red blood cells. But it still didn't follow that the purpose of my life was to make red blood cells. I mean, sometimes businesses make mistakes or the world changes, and they do have to focus only on profits. But that still doesn't mean that's the purpose of the business. Purpose is something else. It's what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's what entrepreneurs are on fire about. Most successful entrepreneurs, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but most of them are not trying to make as much money as they can. They see the world differently, and they're trying to share that with the rest of us. A friend who started a restaurant in Copenhagen called Nomo, which was seen as the best restaurant in the world for some time. And he said, you know, we didn't start Nomo to make as much money as we could because honestly, we didn't make any for the first 19 years it was open. Well, he's done okay since, but You know, it's a different thing. The only place entrepreneurs start businesses to maximize the value is in business school textbooks. Real entrepreneurs start businesses because they have a passion for something. And it's not on the other side of it, you know, this idea that profits are somehow dirty or wrong or something is a silly idea. Businesses have to make money. They have to make money in what our finance colleagues would tell us is the weighted average cost of capital, which is a complicated formula. It's mostly around 10% most of the time, but they have a complicated formula for figuring it out. And businesses have to do that, because if you can't do that, unless you've got a money pump machine somewhere, you're going to have to shut the door. So it's purpose and profits. It's not one or the other. It's not only focus on profits don't matter. And it's certainly not only focus on profits, purpose doesn't matter. It's both of those things, and trying to figure out how they go together. Second idea, it's about stakeholders and shareholders. Again, saying it's about stakeholders is easy to say, but it's a little harder to do because stakeholder interests go together. It's not that you can trade them off with each other. To be successful, you have to figure out how you can get customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money kind of going in the same direction. Some people say you want to align the interests. I don't like that metaphor very much. I'm kind of a amateur musician, and I think a better metaphor is to say their interests need to be harmonized. Why? Because notes that are in harmony, they're different, but they sound good together. Stakeholder interests are different, but you got to make them sound good together. You got to see stakeholders in relationship terms. One of the biggest mistakes we make in business is we accept this primarily, this idea from economic theory, that there are always a set of discrete transactions that we can add up, and that's the relationship. Now think about it for a minute. Think about the people you have relationships with. Might be a friend, might be a lover, might be a partner, a spouse. What does it mean to be in a relationship? Well, there's a presumption that relationship's going to continue through time. There's an assumption on both parts that both parties care for each other. And you don't have to keep score every day. If I went out in the hall down to my wife's office, she worked at Darden as well on the administrative side, and I said, "Hey, babe, you know, we've been married 45 years, but I've been thinking about it, and I think you owe me 3. I think you're up 3." I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that would be. And since she's a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be so healthy for me. Why? You don't have to keep score. Look, there may come a time when relationship has to end with a customer or an employee or even a spouse, and those things happen. But that's not always. If ending the relationship is always something you're thinking about all the time, then you probably ought to end it. Rather than seeing, how can we make each other better off? And so seeing stakeholders in this relationship way is really central. So purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders. We got to see business as a societal institution. Business can have incredible effects on society. Witness the work of companies like Pfizer and Moderna for vaccines with the pandemic. Now, they didn't do that alone. There were government researchers and universities and others that were part, but business has a role to play. And seeing it as a societal institution rather than just a competitive market institution is important. We will never solve global warming if business is not a part of it. We will never solve inequality and poverty if business is not a part of it. We will never solve racial and gender and class discrimination if business is not a part of it. It's not a matter of, some people said, well, this is woke capitalism. Nonsense. It's not about that. It's about business being responsible and being community and society builders. And that's what most of us expect. Suppose our universities did nothing but worry about how competitive they were with other universities. We really would leave so much value on the table that we shouldn't really even deserve to exist. So purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, society and market forces. Fourth, we need to see people as fully human. Look, as well as economic. Sure, we can be one-dimensional economic beings who want to maximize our short-term self-interest. And surely we all know people for whom that's what they try to do all the time. If they do it all the time, I'd be willing to say those aren't people we care to be around very much. And we do have a name for them. We call them sociopaths. And I don't know about where you are, but here we tend to elect them to office. That's a nonpartisan statement coming from me. We elect them on both sides. But we know anybody who's ever had a child or who's been in love knows we're capable of so much more. Human beings are not these one-dimensional creatures. We are people who, yes, can put a person on the moon, can explore our universe to its depths, and who can evoke the poetry of Neruda, of a Robert Browning, of an Elizabeth Barrett Browning, of any number of poets and writers, etc. We are capable of incredible acts of kindness and love, in addition to horrible and more recently twisted acts of self-interest, like some of the shootings that we've had. In other words, we need to see people as fully morally complex, not just economic beings. So purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, societal and market forces, seeing people as fully human as well as economic. And finally, we need to put ethics together with business. When I tell people I teach business ethics, you know what they say. They have to manage not to laugh. They say things like must be a short course, or I didn't know business had any, or must be a theoretical subject. Because that's a joke, it's a joke because of the old story. We need to see business and ethics as how those things go together, etc. So these 5 ideas that companies around the world are beginning to deal with, I'm very optimistic that we're on the verge of really a revolution. There are barriers to the revolution. There are barriers to this, and it's a conceptual revolution. Some of the barriers are, certainly in business schools, we too often commit what I call the separation fallacy. We separate business and ethics, or descriptive and normative, or science and non-science. And even though there are good philosophical and practical reasons for not doing that, those distinctions are deep in the hearts of many of our professor colleagues. And what that does is it sets up a way of thinking about dichotomies that we don't need to. We need to think about how we use our creative imagination to overcome those dichotomies. The business sucks story is alive and well in the world. That business is somehow morally questionable. The challenges that face us today are challenges around how do we say what total performance is for business. I'm convinced profits don't measure total performance. I'm pretty certain about that. I'm less convinced that I know how to measure total performance. What's the role of creative imagination? Here, I think business schools don't do a very good job. We do a really good job of socializing students. We don't do such a great job of having them use their creative imagination. And the problem with that is soon AIs are going to be doing everything else. So all we've got as human beings, is our creative imagination. Someone said, I don't remember who, you can only live the life that you can imagine. And I think that's absolutely right. As we create our lives, we're limited in that creation by what we can imagine them to be. And so thinking about creative imagination is one of those things that, it's a muscle. And if you don't use it, it atrophies. We see this already. We know studies of, the most creative people among us are kindergartners. And as people advance through school, their creativity goes down. And so we have to figure that out, because I think it's crucial to the survival of an interesting sense of business. We need to rethink the role of governments and stakeholder partnerships with NGOs and businesses. I've been working with a business family in Indonesia, and the family has taken it upon itself to sponsor research and experiments that try to put an end to dengue fever. I don't know if you know what dengue fever is. I suspect you do, because I know there are parts of Metro that have to deal with this. But what this business family did over really a 15-year period was they figured out a way that you can reduce dengue in an area by something like 77%. And it was their persistence in the fact that you had a number of NGOs and volunteers and other stakeholders figure out how to work together in this sort of massive stakeholder engagement project. We need more of that. We need to think about.
Thank you very much. I just would like to ask you if we can have our
Sure.
closure as well for 5 minutes, so we can leave room for everybody to express their thoughts, or if anybody could have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Can use the room. Thank you.
Great.
Oh, I'll chime in real quick. I just have a quick question about the power of and. So the 5 things you went through: understanding purpose, shareholders and stakeholder relationships, businesses, societal institution, those do you expand on all those in that most recent book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the book's organized around those five
Okay.
things. And
Great,
what we
thank you.
do is we've got about 100 examples or so in the book
Okay.
of how companies do, are doing those things. I gave the short version of that because Salfonso wanted me to talk about sort of the development of stakeholder theory as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Anyone else have a questions for our guest today? Okay, Angel Baez, do you want to?
Oh yeah. Oh, can you hear me well?
Yep. Good.
All right. How can we link poverty and the global warming with the business? How can we link the solvency of those problems with business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the way I would do it is to have businesses think through how they want to make their communities better. So for instance, if you had lots of businesses say, what we're going to think about is how we can raise the level of the least well off in our community. Again, what we need is lots of experiments. We don't know how to always do this. But if we have lots of experiments and people trying stuff, we might find a number of things that work. Muhammad Yunus and his development of microfinance in Bangladesh is a terrific example of how this worked. In terms of global warming, again, I think what we need is lots of experiments. We need people starting businesses who have a different idea about how energy works, about how I just saw recently some engineers had invented a leaf that actually absorbed more carbon dioxide than the leaves that are on trees. You know, there are literally thousands of experiments going on. Some of them are going to work. And I like to think about it like that, rather than thinking about how are we going to cut back consumption, cut back this, cut back that. Those ideas generally sound good, but they're tough in practice to make. So I think we need thousands of entrepreneurs starting businesses that, yeah, they need to make money and they need to figure out how to make the world greener. We see that. There are lots and lots of companies doing that. It would be nice if government helped.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else would like to comment, to make a question?
Doctor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. With how nowadays society is moving, how businesses are evolving, where do you see this stakeholder theory is going? Will it be playing a bigger role in the future, in the society, in business administration?
Well, that's a good question, Pedro. I don't hear anybody arguing, hey, I know how we're going to solve all these problems, the problems of discrimination and global warming and poverty and the pandemic. Let's really go focus on shareholders. I don't hear anybody arguing that, except people that think there's nothing wrong. So I think, yes, I think the tide has turned. The tipping point has been reached, and people are beginning to see, hey, we can think about this better. It's a little bit like in the 17th century, the French author Molière wrote a comedy, and one of his characters said, you know, he needed to speak better prose. And the character thought he had to learn a new language. And he later understood that he was already speaking prose. And so it's a little bit like businesses have to understand they are creating value and destroying it for stakeholders. If you realize that, you can do it better. You can create more value. You can find ways to get interest going in the same direction. So I see that as a train that's left the station. And I don't think there's any stopping it, because the companies that figure out how to do that are just going to outperform those that don't. We already see evidence of that. In many studies, we find that companies that take stakeholders seriously simply perform better than those that don't.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, well, I also want to thank everyone for joining us today in this special talk. This was a very inspiring moment for me, because the work from Edward Freeman was one of the most important part in my doctoral thesis. So this was a really exciting moment for me. And I want to thank you from the researchers and professors of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México who joined us, and also the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, and as well the community from the Arkansas State University. So thank you, everybody, and I think I'll see you around.
all.
Thank you.
you.